All right, so today we're going to be going over command of evidence questions. So there are many forms of this type of question. There are many different sorts of questions that you can get that are command of evidence. There's science passages and there's fiction-based passages. Today we're going to focus on the more science passages because they come up a little more often. So you essentially always have to do the same thing. You have to identify which piece of evidence backs up a certain claim. And this can involve picking the right data from a graph or chart, or choosing the expected outcome of an experiment, or picking the right quote from a book that would support a claim, all sorts of stuff. So it comes in many different forms, but essentially you're just kind of doing the same thing. So this sort of question, especially the graph questions, become very confusing because honestly they are very quite overwhelming. And even though technically all the information you're supposed to have is in the passage, it can be you can be very easily confused by the terminology and what they're trying to say. So there are a lot of strategies that we can use to break these questions down. So the most important one, I think, is to identify the claim or hypothesis clearly, and you have to rewrite it in your own words or restate it in your head. Pretty often this is going to be found in like the last sentence or maybe second to last sentence, something like that. And this is usually necessary with graph questions because you have to kind of make links between information to match up the claim to the graph. That's going to make more sense once I demonstrate. But regardless of whatever question it is, you have to rewrite the claim in your own words because if you're just looking how it is presented in the passage, you're going to get confused very easily. And with graph questions, only skim the graph before reading. I think it's always a good idea to get a to see what your chart titles are. If you have a chart, you have like a bar graph, line graph, stuff like that. See what information that it's giving you, but just don't overanalyze the graph. Once you read the question, you're gonna have a better idea of like where specifically you need to look or what you should be picking up on. Sometimes, though, you don't always need to fully understand the graph because once you read the passage, you need to recognize what information the right answer should be pointing out quite clearly. So, are we comparing one data point to another? If we are, what should we be comparing? Or are we pointing out a decrease or increase over time? So, even without looking at the graph or the answer choices, after we read the passage, we should be figuring out, like, okay, what should the answer include? And then once we have that idea, it's a lot easier to go back to the graph and eliminate answer choices because some answer choices, even if they do have the right like values and right names for stuff, they might not be directly proving the claim. They're not comparing the right things. They're not pointing out the right information. So sometimes the wording of the answer choices is enough to find the right answer. But again, you still will rely on the graph a little bit. The answer choices are meant to confuse you, so don't panic if you don't get them at the first read. It always took me a couple of reads to kind of understand the answer choices. But once an answer choice does sound like it would support the claim, and especially if there are multiple answers that sound kind of correct, then just check if the details actually match up with what the graph is saying. And if you're stuck, you can eliminate answer choices that have incorrect values or information. That's a pretty easy way to eliminate answer choices, even when you're stuck. Okay, so let's just really briefly look at the graph. So just looking at it, I have a line chart and it's the number of young fish collected at some stuff. Okay, so we're talking about fish. I see a little legend in the bottom. I see some seasons in like the x-axis and on the y-axis just saying number of fish. So that's all I kind of need to understand right now. Okay, so let's read the passage. Mangroves are trees or bushes that grow on the coastline of seas and rivers. Areas with mangroves are great places for young fish since they help keep these fish fed and protected while they grow. To study the importance of mangroves to young fish, blah 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 identified young fish from 3 different mangrove sites in the Egyptian Red Sea. They collected fish in the winter, spring, and autumn of 2010, collecting a total of 269 fish from 21 different species. For some species, more fish were collected in the winter than the other 2 seasons. For instance, and here you're going to have to choose the right evidence. So you'll notice that there's a lot of information that they give you up here, but honestly, you don't need to understand all of it. So we don't really care about the benefits of mangroves and how great they are. You usually just need to narrow in on this claim, especially for longer passages. So all we are basically the claim that they're presenting is that more fish were collected in for some species, more fish were collected in the winter than the two other seasons. And if I look at my graph, it's telling me how many of each fish were caught during like each 3 seasons. So if I had to restate the claim, I would just say certain species were collected the most during the winter because there's only 3 seasons, right? So if winter is more than the other 2 seasons, that means most of the fish were collecting in winter for certain species. So, if I'm just glancing at the graph, I can see that that is true. Like for this one, especially like look how many caught in the winter and not that much in spring and fall. So, what are we comparing in the answer choices? Well, we should be comparing the amount of fish collected during the winter versus the other 2 seasons for the same fish. So, we're not necessarily comparing one type of fish to another type of fish. For the same fish, we're saying we want to compare how much they caught in winter versus spring and fall. So, the answer should be explicitly be comparing across seasons for the same fish. So take a second to see which one does that the best. Okay, so I think A. More common silver biddy in milkfish were collected in the winter than either of the two other seasons. So here they're talking about just 2 fish, but they're saying for both of them, which I can see that just based on the legend in the graph, the most were collected in the winter versus spring and fall. So we're talking about this like one fish. We're not comparing these fish. We're just saying for both of them, winter was more than the other 2 seasons. So it's an explicit comparison. It does what it needs to do, and it also matches up with the graph. Let's see why the other ones are wrong. The common silver biddy was collected more frequently than the other 2 species. Well, here in all 3 seasons, so we're supposed to be comparing winter versus the other seasons. This is not doing that. This is comparing one fish to the other fish. That's not what we want to do. And also, we don't know about how frequently. In the spring, researchers collected more red sea goldfish than they collected from the other 2 species. Again, now we're just talking about the spring, and we're comparing the fish species to each other. So it's not even mentioning winter, and it's not comparing what we need to compare. So that's why C is incorrect. And then D, in the fall, researchers collected 10 common silver biddy but collected no milkfish or red sea goatfish. Same problem. We're not even mentioning winter. We're just narrowing in on the values for one specific season. So there's no comparison. So again, I didn't need to look at the graph to figure out like, okay, none of these are wrong because they're just not comparing winter and the other 2 seasons like the passage or the claim wants us to do. A is the only one that even does that remotely. So again, you don't need to understand the graph, but if you go back, you will see that it supports what this piece of evidence is saying. All right, so this is a different sort of question where you have to pick a quote from like an article or a book or something that backs up a claim in the passage. In addition to her technical skill and daring feats, American stunt pilot Bessie Coleman was also known for dazzling the crowds that came to watch her air shows in the 1920s with her exuberant personality. During her career, she was careful and purposeful about how she crafted her public persona. An aviation researcher has claimed that Coleman intentionally defied social norms of the time by how she chose to present herself to the public. Okay, so a short passage. Basically, there was a stunt pilot, Bessie Coleman. She was a woman during the 1920s, so there were probably like social norms about women or pilots, something like that. And the researcher is claiming that she intentionally presented herself that in a way that defied social norms for the time. So if I had to restate that just to be a little simpler, I would just say that she dressed or acted differently than society expected her to for the public or in front of people, just out and about. So maybe take a second to see which one illustrates this claim most clearly. I think D does that the best. So, although female pilots were typically expected to wear traditional but impractical attire that included dresses or skirts, photos of Coleman showed her wearing pants and leather jackets. So, yeah, so society expected female pilots to wear skirts and stuff, but she wore pants and leather jackets. So she dressed differently if people are taking photos of her, that means she's out in public. So that means she's dressing intentionally different from the social norms in front of other people. Let's see what the other ones are not as great. So A, for her air shows, Coleman frequently used the Curtiss JN4 or Jenny, which was at the time one of the most well-known types of planes. This is just talking about the type of plane she used, so it really has nothing to do with anything. B, while Coleman was beloved by spectators for her charisma, she had a more complicated relationship with her managers and staff, who at times found her behavior too impulsive and demanding. So this one might be tempting because it is saying that she's a little irritating, a little frustrating, which if we're thinking about women in the 1920s, maybe your outside knowledge is you're correctly thinking like, okay, women weren't really expected to be impulsive or demanding or anything. But we're talking about how she chose to present herself to the public. And this one is talking about her private life. And it's not emphasizing that she's defying social norms in her private life. It's just saying that she was a little irritating. She was a little annoying. So it's not talking about how she presented herself to the public. So even though it might seem like she's acting out of the social norms for a woman, that's kind of bringing in outside information about what you know. It's not explicitly saying that she defies social norms like D is doing. It literally tells you the norm and then tells you how she defied it. C, Coleman once considered leaving her career as a stunt pilot to focus her efforts on giving speeches, which she felt would better support her public image. Again, nothing about social norms or defying social norms. She just wanted to maybe change her career. It doesn't say if that's abnormal for a woman or abnormal for a pilot to do. We really don't know any of that. So D most clearly shows the social norm that she is defying, shows how she defied it, and it also is obviously like how she dressed in front of the public. So that's how that one best proves our claim. Okay, so we have another graph question. So looking really briefly at, we have a chart now. So effect of paywall introduction on newspaper companies' revenues, whatever. So I see that they give me a name of a newspaper, revenue change. They also give me like a percent change. And they also tell me the size of the newspaper. So now that I know what's included, that's all I need to know. I can move on to the passage. Okay, so digital paywalls restrict access to online content to those with a paid subscription. In an investigation of the effect of paywalls on newspaper company revenues for print and digital subscriptions and advertising, these people compared actual outcomes with a paywall to control estimates without a paywall. The researchers concluded that introducing a paywall is generally more beneficial for larger newspapers, which have high circulation and tend to offer a substantial amount of unique content online. Okay, so this one is a little wordy, a little longer, but if I break it down to its bare bones, I can see that my conclusion is just right in this first part of the last sentence. So you don't need to totally understand what a paywall is, okay? You just need to know that when they introduced this paywall, they concluded that it's more beneficial for larger newspapers. And by more beneficial, since we're talking about making money, it just means like more, it'll be more profitable for larger newspapers. And it gives the reason, but again, I don't really think it matters that much. So if I had to restate the claim without understanding everything that a paywall is, that's fine if you don't get it. All you have to say is that large newspapers make more money with the paywall. So the bigger you are, the more money you're going to make with the paywall. Which is, I'm guessing, that's why they're giving me the newspaper size for certain newspapers in this chart, along with how much money or the change in the revenue. So, if I had to pick an answer choice that showed this most clearly, I think that we're comparing the profits or the revenue for large newspapers versus small newspapers because we want to show that the larger your newspaper, the more money you're going to make. So, the only way to do that is to compare a large newspaper to a small newspaper and the revenues for each. So, again, I don't need to understand everything that a paywall is, I don't need to understand everything about this chart. I just need to know that large papers make money, small newspapers maybe don't make money or make less money. Okay, so here you're gonna have to maybe refer back to the chart a couple of times for certain things, but see which one best compares or illustrates the point. Okay, so in this case, I'm thinking it's going to have to be C. So the New York Times had a 20% revenue change, while the Denver Post had a negative 1% revenue change. So again, this revenue change is meaning like after you introduce the paywall, how much is your revenue changing? So if we have like a positive change, that means their revenue went up. Negative percent change means the revenue went down, pretty much. Okay. So I like this one because if we see the New York Times, it's a large newspaper, which had a positive revenue change, and the Denver Post is a small newspaper and it had a negative revenue change. So it's comparing the large newspapers and a large newspaper and a small newspaper and illustrating how one benefited while one didn't, which is pretty much proving the claim that it's more beneficial for large newspapers. Now let's look at why the other ones are wrong. So the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times had similar total revenue changes, but the LA Times had a smaller percentage change. Immediately, this is wrong because if I look back, both the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times are large newspapers. But I can't prove this claim if I'm just comparing two large newspapers, right? I need to compare a large one to a small one to show that the large ones are the ones that benefit. So this one is incorrect. And then B, this is also talking about the same two newspapers and comparing them, but they're still two large newspapers. So again, same problem. D, the Denver Post only had a negative 1% revenue change, which was the smallest percent change of the selected companies. Again, we're only talking about a small newspaper here, and we're not comparing a large newspaper. This one isn't even discussing large newspapers. So how are we going to go from this piece of evidence to learning that it's more beneficial for larger newspapers? So that doesn't really make any sense. So again, without totally understanding the graph and reading everything about the graph, I just need to know that I'm comparing a large newspaper versus a small newspaper to show that the big newspaper makes money and the small ones really don't. So that's all you really need to do to figure out how to do these sorts of questions. Okay, this is our last one. So again, no graph, but you still have to do the same thing, find the evidence that matches up with the claim. The Milky Way galaxy is composed of millions of stars in a relatively flat structure containing a thin disk and a thick disk. Based on computer simulations and analysis of data on the brightness, position, and chemical composition of about 250,000 stars in the thick disk, collected from two telescopes, one in China and one orbiting in space, astrophysicists, blah blah blah, claim that the thick disk of the Milky Way formed in two distinct phases rather than a single one. Okay. So here they give you a lot of information about like what they analyzed, how many stars they analyzed, like what they analyzed it with. But that's kind of like distracting information meant to overwhelm you, sort of. The all you need to know is that this galaxy has a thin disk and a thick disk, and everything is just made of stars, right? And we're just saying that the stars in the thick disk formed in two distinct phases rather than a single one. I'm thinking that means they formed at like two separate times rather than like all of the stars just kind of formed at once. So if I had to restate that in my own words, I'd just say like the stars in the thick disk form mainly at two separate times. So think of it as like one group forming right now and then another group of stars forming at a later time. But they're just basically two main times. Okay, so see which of the answer choices best backs up this claim that we got. Okay, so B, there's an age difference about 2 billion years between certain stars in the thick disk. I think that's pretty much what I'm saying. So, what at one point one group of stars formed, and then 2 billion years later, another group of stars formed. So that's why there's an age difference about 2 billion years. That's pretty much what we're saying. The time between those two separate events was 2 billion years. So they formed at different times in history. Let's see what the other ones are wrong. So A, the telescopes used by the researchers have detected stars of similar ages and galaxies other than the Milky Way. We're talking about stars inside the thick disk, not outside of the Milky Way, so that doesn't really make any sense. C, the thin disk contains about twice as many stars that can be seen from Earth as a thick disk does. We're not comparing the thin disk versus the thick disk. We're comparing the stars inside the thick disk. So that doesn't really make any sense. This passage has nothing to do with the thin disk, even though they mention it in the beginning. And then D, the stars in the Milky Way tend to have very similar chemical compositions. May be true, but that doesn't have anything to do with when they formed. That's just pointing at a similarity. We want to point out that they formed at two different phases, and D isn't really talking about that. They're just talking about a similarity. So B just illustrates that the stars formed at two different times. Not all of the stars formed at the same time, pretty much. So that's why B is going to be the best answer. Again, even though there's not a graph, still you need to recognize like what are you comparing? We're comparing the stars in the thick disk, and then see which one, once you read that piece of evidence, does remind you of that initial claim. Okay, so I'm going to quickly look at the graph. So I see I have like a line graph, and it says number of infrared beam breaks by mice treated with cyano or saline by sex. Okay, I don't really know what that means, but that's fine. X-axis is minutes from treatment, it's like time. Y-axis is number of beam breaks or beams broken. I don't know what that means, but at least I have some sort of value here. And on the bottom, I see like a legend, females with saline, males with saline, males with cyano, females with cyano. Okay, so some sort of experiment probably. I don't know what all this means, but it's good that I got an idea of like what I'm looking at. To investigate the influence of certain estrogen-responsive neurons on energy expenditure, big words, we don't need to understand what they mean, biologists, blah, 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 treated female and male mice with either saline solution or claws or whatever, cyano, which activates the neurons. Okay, so the cyano stuff activates neurons. Monitoring the activity levels of the mice by measuring how frequently the animals broke infrared beams crossing their enclosures, they found that the mice in their study showed sex-specific differences in response to neuron activation. Okay, so it's short, but there's a lot of information here. So I don't need to understand what this estrogen blah 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 means, okay? It's just saying that they gave them saline, which doesn't seem to do anything. It doesn't say it does anything. And they also gave them cyano, which activates the neurons, which is pretty much like stuff in your head. And they monitor the neuron activity by seeing how frequently they broke these infrared beams. So if I have to, I kind of have to make a link in my head now, because in this graph it doesn't say anything about neuron activation, but it's telling me about beam breaks. So you need to keep in your mind that more neuron activity means more beams broken, okay? And CNO is what activates the neuron. So saline is probably like a baseline. Like they're giving it to both as like kind of to see what happens normally, and then CNO is like the special thing. What happens when we add CNO? But basically, the more beams broken means the more neuron activity there is. And basically, their claim is that the males and females responded differently in response to neuron activation. Neuron activation in this case means when they're given CNO, because again, CNO is what activates neurons. So that means there's differences when males get CNO versus females get CNO. So that means our answer choice that supports this claim here, we need to be comparing the behavior of CNO males versus CNO females. And once you read the answer choices, you'll see you don't need to keep looking at this graph. Just see which answer choices compare CNO males and CNO females. Okay, so take a second to see which answers, or one answer, does that. Which one compares CNO males and CNO females? Okay, so I would say C is going to be the best answer here. So CNO treated females show more activity related to saline treated females than CNO treated males showed relative to saline treated males. Basically, they're saying if we're taking saline as a baseline, the CNO females had a really big difference in behavior. The CNO males didn't really change that much. Now, you might be thinking, well, D, which says CNO treated females showed a substantial increase in decline in activity over the monitoring period, whereas CNO treated males showed a substantial decline in activity followed by a steep increase. That's still comparing CNO females and CNO males. However, now we can, between these two, how are we going to pick what's correct? Well, let's see which one actually matches up with the graph. Okay, now we actually have to go back to the graph. So let's look at females. So I'm seeing females with saline is this triangle one, and females with CNL is this star one. So you can see the star one is really high. So the saline behavior and the females with CNO behavior is very different. Look how high this is, and like this is kind of with everything else, but look how high this is. So there is a really big difference, more activity. They're breaking a lot more beams than with the saline females, which means their neurons are more activated. So they're showing more activity. Now let's look at the males. Okay, so the males with saline, it's this square bar, and the males with CNO is this circle bar. So the circle bar is showing more beams broken or more neuron activation than the square bar, but it's not as big of a difference as than for the females. Like this is kind of with everything else, and look how high, how much more beams the females with CNO are breaking. This is true. The females showed more activity relative to the other females than the males. The males didn't have that big of a difference in activity. So that's already correct. So if that's enough for you, that's totally great. But D is actually wrong because the CNO females do show a substantial increase and then decrease. So that part is correct. But the males with CNO, again, this circle bar, it says they showed a substantial decline and then a steep increase. But if you look here, it just kind of keeps going down. There is no like really big increase like there is for the females with CNO. It's just like sort of the same, and then it keeps going down. So there is no steep increase anywhere. Okay, it just kind of slowly is going down. And there is sort of a steep decrease here, but there is no steep increase if you look at the graph. So C and D, A and B we can eliminate because this isn't comparing between sexes, and then B is only talking about saline treated females, not CNO treated females. C and D both compare CNO females and CNO males. Now you have to kind of check with the graph to see which one makes the most sense. But again, you need to recognize what you are comparing. All right, so I have a chart now. So again, let's briefly see what it's giving us. So it says body length, filter time, and lunges per dive for 4 whale species. They give me the species, they tell me the typical body length, the time to filter all engulfed water, and number of lunges per dive deeper than 50 meters. I'm not sure what all these things mean, but at least I know what's given to me. Some whale species practice lunge feeding, in which they lunge toward prey with their mouths open at wide angles, collect the prey and the surrounding water, then filter out the water through baleen plates in their mouths. Although the volume of the water engulfed increases with the whale's body length, the surface area of the whale's baleen plates, which influence the rate at which water can be filtered, does not increase with body length to the same degree, which helps explain why blank. Okay, so this one's a little tricky because they're telling us like a lot of details, like a lot of variables. So it's telling us what lunge feeding is, which isn't really that important. We're just talking about what happens when they need to get rid of the water in their mouths after they catch their prey, right? So we're saying now we have to make some links between the information given to us. So we're saying the volume of the water increases with the whale's body length, which makes sense. And we're saying that the surface area is it kind of equal to the filter rate. So the surface area doesn't really change a lot when body length changes. And since surface area influences the rate at which water is filtered, we can kind of set surface area is equal to filter rate. So we're saying the longer the length, the more volume it filters. But since the surface area doesn't really change between whales, the rate at which it filters out the water doesn't really change. So, if you're longer and you have more water, but the rate at which you're getting out that water is not really changing, so it's the same rate, the more water you have, the slower time it's going to take. And if you look here, it tells us the average time to filter all of the engulfed water, which is what we're going to get if we divide the volume of the water by the rate. Okay? So basically, that just means it takes longer to filter out water for longer whale species because longer whale species, they take the longer you are, the more water you get in your mouth, but you have to get rid of it at the same rate as a smaller whales. Or so you have more water, but it's a slower rate, so that means you get a slower time or you got more time. And that's kind of true because if I look here, then I can see this really long one, like blue whales and like the fin ones. it take a lot of time to get rid of all the water than these shorter ones. So that kind of makes sense. So again, we kind of had to link variables to each other to figure it out, but overall, this is how we can restate this very long sort of claim. So again, what are we comparing in our answer choice? We have to compare longer species filter time versus shorter species filter time, because we're talking about water filtration and we're talking about the length of the whale species, right? You can also think about it like that. We're talking about length and we're talking about stuff to filter out water. So it doesn't really mention about anything about lunges per dive. So we're probably talking about these two variables here for different types of whale species. Okay, so take a second, pause to see which one does this the best. Okay, so I think C does this the best. So fin whales show a longer average filter time than minke whales do. So if I go back to my chart, I can see the fin whale is longer than the minke whale, and it takes more time, which is pretty much what our claim was saying. The longer you are, the more time it takes you to filter out all your water, right? So I think this is true. This shows the claim. Let's look at the other answer choices to see why they're wrong. So minke whales and humpback whales show similar average filter times. No, that's just straight up not true because minke whales take like 9 seconds, humpback take like 18 seconds. And also we're trying to show that the larger you are, there's a difference in filter times. So this one is not doing that. This is trying to say that two whales have similar filter times even though they're very different in size. B, humpback whales show an average of 6.28 lunges per dive. We're not talking about lunges per dive and we're not comparing anything in this answer choice, so this is also kind of irrelevant, off topic. D, blue whales show the longest average filter time and the highest average number of lunges per dive. This one might be tempting because it is talking about filter time. You can see that it's the longest whale on here, and it does have the longest average filter time. So that's true. But it kind of brings in this irrelevant point, highest average numbers of lunges per dive. That's kind of off topic. And again, we want to show that the longer you are, the more water you filter out. So we want to compare it to something that is shorter. This is just talking about blue whales. It's not comparing it to a shorter species. So that's why this evidence alone doesn't directly prove the claim. But this one directly proves it because we're comparing a longer one to a shorter one and saying that the longer one takes more time to filter out all the water. So again, this one's a little complicated. You kind of have to think about it. You have to link the variables together to make it make sense with the graph. But also, you don't have to understand everything. You just need to understand that you need to compare a long one and a short one and their filter times. And C is the only answer choice that does this. Okay, so this is a non-graph question. And let's read the question carefully. So here you usually have to directly support their conclusion, but here you need to pick a piece of evidence that would most directly weaken the student's conclusion. So keep that in mind. Matthew D. Rockledge and team examined whether consumer ratings in movies can predict box office success. The team considered both numeric star ratings and written reviews in their research. To analyze the written reviews, a team measured the emotionality, the degree to which a written review expresses an emotional reaction, which is how emotional the review is, of user reviews on a movie rating website, assigning each review an emotionality score. After reviewing this research, a student argues that the emotionality of movie reviews is unrelated to a movie's success at the box office. Okay, so basically, this team is seeing how well reviews can predict how well a movie does, and the student is focusing not on the student is focusing on the emotionality of movie reviews or the written reviews, and we're saying that basically his claim is that the emotional scores of written reviews can't predict office success. So nothing about these written reviews or how emotional they are can tell us how successful these movies are going to be. Okay? So, if we're talking about weakening the student's conclusion, let's think about what the opposite of this would be, right? What the opposite of this statement would simply be that the emotional scores of written reviews can predict box office success. So, based on how emotional the written reviews are, we can see how well the movie is going to do. So, take a second and see which one has the relevant details that kind of undermine this student's claim. Okay, good. So B, the average emotionality score of a movie's reviews was a positive predictor of that movie's box office earnings. Okay, this is kind of directly restating the opposite of his claim. So here we said positive predictor means like it does predict. So the emotionally of score does predict that movie's box office earnings. This is just directly the opposite of our restatement of the student's claims. And so let's see why the other ones are wrong. So A compares movies that it says the movies that had high average emotionality scores receive the lowest average star ratings on movie rating websites. While our piece of evidence has to have something to do with box office success and like how well the movie does. This is just talking about its ratings, so that it's just not have enough to be on topic. C. More than half of the movies that the team examined received an average star rating of 3 out of 5 stars. This student isn't even talking about star rating, so any answer with star ratings in it is going to be wrong. D. The movies that were most successful at the box office tended to have a high average star ratings. Again, this is talking about box office success, but it's talking about the average star ratings. Keep in mind that the student is talking about the emotionality of the written reviews. So nothing about star ratings is going to be relevant when we're talking about this claim. So B, it directly pretty much says that the emotionality score or the emotionality of the reviews could predict that movie's box office earnings. So again, here the trick is to again figure out that restatement of his claim, figure out the opposite. Here it's pretty basic, and see which one matches up with the opposite of the claim. That directly proves the opposite of what here the student is saying. And again, make sure all the details in your answer choice are relevant to what the student is talking about. All right, so let's look at this graph real quick. So it's another line chart and it says seed germination with and without H2S treatment. And here on the x-axis, we got like time. And then we have percent of seeds germinated on the y-axis. And then see this time and it says untreated and then it says 500 micromoles per liter. It's okay if you don't know what a micromole is, that's fine. Okay, so in high concentrations, hydrogen sulfide or H2S is typically toxic to many plants. These people wanted to understand what effects low doses of H2S might have on plant growth. They treated bean, corn, wheat, and pea seeds with various concentrations measured in micromoles per liter. So again, they tell you what this is just like concentration of like how much H2S they're putting of H2S and track the germination of those seeds along with germination of untreated seeds or just normal seeds growing normally without any H2S. Treatment with particular concentrations of H2S was associated with accelerated germination. For example, evidence. Okay, so basically we're just talking about, we're doing an experiment to see if H2S, it's hydrogen sulfide, helps these plants grow. When you say germination, that means like how the seeds grow or like how many seeds actually start growing. Now, if we're talking about acceleration or an accelerated germination, we're talking about like faster germination. So if I had to restate it, I would say adding H2S for like certain concentrations, I guess, makes seeds germinate faster than normal or than untreated, right? So that means we're probably comparing how many seeds germinate with the H2S versus without over the same period of time, because it's only fair if we compare them over the same amount of hours, right? So we want to see if the H2S after the same amount of time makes more seeds germinate than if we didn't put any H2S at all. And just glancing at the graph, I can see that the ones with the H2S definitely do have a lot of growth, but let's see. Okay, so here I think what makes this one tricky mostly is actually the answer choices because they all kind of have the same format. So let's walk through each one this time. So, A, at 24 hours, less than 10% of the seeds treated with H2S at a concentration of 10 micromoles per liter had germinated, whereas more than 90% of those seeds had germinated at 168 hours. Okay, I'm not even going to go to the graph because, again, we're not comparing anything. We're just saying, for this entire answer choice, we're just talking about the concentration of 10 micromoles per liter, like that sample group. We're just talking about how more germinated after more time, but that doesn't prove that the H2S makes it grow more than untreated. So since this is not comparing the 10 micromoles per liter to the untreated one, this is a bad answer. B, at 48 hours, more than 70% of the seeds treated with H2S at a concentration of 10 micromoles per liter had germinated, whereas only 50% of the untreated seeds had germinated. Well, I kind of like this answer because, yeah, we're comparing after the same amount of time, after 48 hours. For the 10 micromoles per liter, 70% of seeds germinated, but for untreated seeds, that's only 50%. So it did make it grow more. So let's see if that's actually accurate with the graph, okay? So if I look here, at 48 hours, looking at the square bar, that is a little more than 70%. And then untreated is this like circle stuff, and at 48 hours, the circle is at 50%. So these values add up, and it's comparing it, and it's showing that H2S makes it go faster than the untreated one. So I like it, but let's check the other ones. At 168 hours, more than 90% of seeds treated with H2S at 10 or 500 micromoles per liter had germinated, whereas less than 70% of untreated seeds had germinated. Well, again, I do kind of like it because it is comparing after the same amount of time, 168 hours, more of the H2S ones germinated than the untreated ones. So why is this could possibly be wrong? Because it might have the wrong values, okay? So at 168 hours, at 10 micromoles per liter, yes, more than 90% germinated. For 500 micromoles per liter, which is this triangle bar, I can see that it's actually a little less than 90, so between 80 and 90%. So it's not more than 90% for both the 10 and 500 ones. It's only more than 90% for 10. So because this is kind of saying wrong information that didn't actually happen in the experiment, this is wrong, even though it sounds right. And then D, at 48 hours, approximately 50% of the seeds treated with H2S at a concentration of 10 micromoles, whatever, had germinated, whereas only approximately 30% of untreated seeds had germinated. Again, it's doing the right thing. It's comparing the H2S ones with the untreated ones, and it's just saying that it's more after the same amount of time. But if we go back to 48 hours, this one also is talking about at 48 hours, and we already verified that this has the right numbers. This one does not, because at 10 micromoles per liter, it has over 70%, not approximately 50%. So by testing it against our comparison and our restatement, we found that other than A, all of these kind of did the same thing. They said after the same amount of time, the H2S ones had more than the untreated ones germinate. And again, you don't even need to know what germination means in this context. You just need to say that one germinates more than the other. So that's fine if you don't know what germination means. But B is the only one that actually had the correct numbers and values for everything in the answer choice. So that's how we understand that B is the right answer. So getting the restatement and comparing does help. But here I think you do kind of have to read the graph carefully to get your answer. All right, so this is our last one, and here we have a bar graph for the first time. So let's quickly scan over it. So it says participants' responses to 3 review conditions. Okay, so here I'll look at the legend first. So it says no anger, high anger, low anger. Then we have helpfulness of the review and attitude towards reviewed product. And here we have participants' rating. And so higher values means like more positive opinion, I guess. So I guess this is a bar chart. It's kind of telling us for different sorts of reviews, their helpfulness and their attitude towards the product, I guess. Okay. So to understand how expressions of anger in reviews of products affect readers of those reviews, business scholar blah 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 measured study participants' responses to 3 versions of the same negative review. A control review expressing no anger, a review expressing a high degree of anger, and a review expressing a low degree of anger. Reviewing the data, a student concludes that the mere presence of anger in a review may not negatively affect readers' perceptions of the review, but a high degree of anger in a review does worsens readers' perceptions of the view. Okay, so basically they're just kind of saying what happens when participants read like three different levels of angry for the same sort of complaint probably. How helpful do they find it pretty much, and then how do they kind of view the product after reading each negative review? And it shows us this for each different type of review, okay? And basically they're saying that a student, so when you have like just low anger, so when you say just mere presence of anger, that means like probably like if even if there's low anger, it might not negatively affect perceptions of the review, but if there is a high degree of anger, that is going to worsen the reader's opinion of the review. So the link I do have to make here, because we have two. We have helpfulness of review and attitude towards the product. But when we're saying perceptions of the review, we're probably talking about the helpfulness of review, because perceptions of the review is just pretty much like our thoughts about the review. And here, thoughts about the review is just how helpful they think the review is. So we can kind of just ignore this attitude toward the reviewed product part, because this isn't really the claim isn't talking about the attitude toward the review. We're just talking about attitude toward the product. We're just talking about the review itself. So perceptions of the review equals helpfulness of the review. So if I had to restate the conclusion, they're just pretty much saying like only high anger will worsen the helpfulness of the review. So only if there's a lot of anger, people are going to be like, actually, this isn't that helpful. So what are we comparing? We're just saying the difference from the control helpfulness for higher anger versus low anger. So if we had just have a review with no anger, we want to compare what happens when there's low anger versus what happens when there's high anger, because they are saying that low anger is not really going to, just having a little bit of anger is not really going to do anything, or it's not going to negatively affect the helpfulness review. It just high degrees of anger is going to make it seem less helpful. So we want to pick an answer that just points this out, that low anger is still sort of helpful, high anger is less helpful than a no anger review. Okay, so read through these, and again, they're kind of long, but see which one best addresses the helpfulness part of a low anger review versus a high anger review. Okay, so I think B does this the best. So compared with participants who saw the control review, like we said, participants who saw the low anger review rated the review as slightly more helpful, whereas participants who saw the high anger review rated the review as less helpful. So that's true. So if I look here, this high anger bar is less than the no anger, and low anger is actually higher than no anger. So they thought the low anger was actually helpful, so they were not negatively affected, they were positively affected, like the student is saying. But yeah, high anger, it was less helpful. So this is pretty much what we said. It's the restatement. Only the high anger one really worsened the helpfulness of the review. Let's look at the other answer choices. On average, participants' ratings of the helpfulness of the review were substantially higher than participants' ratings of the reviewed product, regardless of which type of review participants had seen. Well, this is sort of silly because we're bringing in ratings of the reviewed product. That's not relevant to this claim. We're not talking about the product. We're just talking about the review itself. So this answer is kind of confusing. Also says regardless of which type of review participants had seen. We're trying to point out what happens when you have different sort of reviews. We're saying that the results are different. So if an answer is talking about regardless of which type of review participants had seen, that's not the direction we want to go in. We want to be comparing different types of reviews. So A is irrelevant, off topic, and is not really comparing between reviews. C, participants who saw the low anger review rated the review as slightly more helpful than participants who saw the control review did. That's true. But participants' attitude towards the reviewed product was slightly worse when participants saw the low anger review than when they saw the no anger review. Okay, so this one isn't even mentioning high anger, so that's your first red flag. Honestly, I think also with this one, the answer choices are a little confusing, but we can still eliminate it even if I don't totally understand it, right? So it's talking about attitude toward reviewed product again, that's not relevant. And it's not even mentioning high anger, it's just talking about low anger and no anger. So this is irrelevant, okay? Okay, now D, compared with participants who saw the low anger review, participants who saw the high anger review rated the review as less helpful and had less positive attitude towards the reviewed product. Okay, this one is a little bit tempting because it is true. It's saying that the high anger helpfulness is lower than the low anger helpfulness, and the high anger attitude towards the product is lower than the low anger attitude toward the product. But again, we want to show also the other part of it is that low anger is not negatively affecting perceptions of the view relative to the no anger review. So again, this is also bringing in the attitude towards the reviewed product, again irrelevant. But even if we're just focusing on the helpfulness part, it's just comparing high anger to low anger. But we don't know. This could also mean that low anger also had negative negative effects. It's just that high anger had even more negative effects. That's what I could also infer from D. But we want to show that low anger doesn't have any negative effects. And to do that, we need to compare both to the no anger situation because that's kind of our baseline. So we need to show, like B did, that compared with no anger, low anger actually had slightly positive results and high anger had negative results. And D does not compare it back to the no anger. And all three other ones mention the attitude toward the reviewed product, but that's not what the conclusion is talking about. We're just talking about the helpfulness. So even though these answer choices are a little confusing, honestly, I don't even totally understand them because they're very quite wordy. I think B is the simplest to understand, and it does exactly what we did before we went to the answer choices. It points out that high anger worsens the helpfulness of the review, while low anger doesn't really do anything, and it does it in a more clear wording, and also does not bring in the attitudes toward the reviewed product. So complicated, but it shows how you don't need to understand every little thing to get to the right answer. All right, so here we have another bar graph. So it says, first seal REM sleep on land after an extended period in the water. Okay. Okay, so it looks in the legend I'm talking about like 3 seals. It says sleep on land, and we have 2 days, I guess, we're observing. And this y-axis is telling me REM sleep as a percent of baseline. And it says mean difference from baseline, blah, blah, blah. I don't really know what that means. That's fine. So it's kind of telling me like maybe how much REM sleep they're getting, I guess, as like a percent for 2 different days for 3 different seals. That's all I need to kind of understand. Research suggests that REM sleep in animals is homeostatically regulated. It's okay if you don't know what that is because they're about to tell us. Animals compensate for periods of sleep deprivation by increasing subsequent REM sleep or the next time they sleep. When on land, fur seals get enough REM sleep, but during the weeks they're in water, they get almost none. In a study of fur seal sleep habitats, researchers recorded the REM sleep as a percentage of baseline, or how much like normal sleep is, of fur seals once they had returned to land. They concluded that REM sleep may not be homeostatically regulated in fur seals, citing as evidence the fact that the seals in the study blank. Okay, so what are they saying here? So basically, they're saying this REM sleep, whatever that means, the sleep, when they're in the water, they barely get anything, right? But if they're homeostatically regulated, that means when they get on land, if they're deprived of it during the water and they want to compensate for that sleep on land, that kind of means like they're overcompensating when on land. That means they're getting over 100% sleep, sort of. So it's like they're trying to make up for all the nights that they lost sleep. So now they're going to sleep even more than they normal do to make sure they're getting enough sleep overall. But if they're saying that the sleep may not be homeostatically regulated in fur seals, their conclusion is that seals aren't always overcompensating for sleep on land. If they were homeostatically regulated, then they would be doing that pretty consistently. But if they're not homeostatically regulated, and this is their definition for homeostatic regulation, their statement is probably just that seals aren't always doing that over 100% sleep on land. They're not always overcompensating. So I'm not sure if we're necessarily comparing anything here. I'm not sure about that. But I think a possible answer should point out that that REM percentage of baseline is going to be like a normal night of sleep when you're not overcompensating. That percentage isn't always above 100% because above 100% means you're overcompensating. But we're saying that they're not always overcompensating. So it should point out some data that shows that. Okay, so take a second to see which answer choice kind of does the job here. I think C does. So the seals in the study didn't consistently demonstrate a significant increase in REM sleep after their period of deprivation in the water. So it doesn't technically say that it doesn't technically quote the numbers, but it is pretty much saying, it's just saying that they didn't always have a lot of increase in sleep after they got out of the water, which is true because if we're looking here, for some of the seals, they're almost getting like less than 100%. So not all of them are necessarily doing that overcompensation. Let's see why the other ones are wrong. So A didn't show significantly less REM sleep during the second day after returning to land than they did during the first day. So this is not actually true for all the seals because again they're saying seals in the study in general. So whatever we say should apply to all the seals. But if you look at seal B, which is this like dark gray bar, like the first one, on day 2 he got a lot less sleep than he did on day 1, right? So this is just not true for seal B. So it's not true for all of them. B showed no significant differences from one another in baseline levels of REM sleep. This is just not true because here Seal C on day 1 got a lot less than them, and then day 2 Seal A got a lot more than the other two. So there are a lot of differences from one another for both days. And then D showed no significant difference between REM sleep after returning to land and REM sleep while in the water. Well, we don't have any data about how much REM sleep they got in the water, so we don't have enough information to make this comparison because we don't know how much they got in the water. So we can't say if there's a significant difference or not. So C is the only one which we actually have proof for and actually applies to them. Just in general, they didn't always, demonstrate not all of them, demonstrated a big increase in REM sleep after their period of deprivation in the water. So it seems a little complex because, it's introducing this like homeostatic regulation. Once you go through the answer choices, you can just kind of eliminate them by looking at the graph because they're wrong or we just don't have enough information for them. Okay, so this one doesn't have a graph, but honestly, I think this one is really confusing, all the passage and the answer choices, but let's see how we can break a question like this down. So neural networks are computer models intended to reflect the organization of human brains and are often used in studies of brain function. According to an analysis of 11,000 such networks, these people advise caution when drawing conclusions about the brain from observations of neural networks. Okay, so they're not that similar that we can just say anything about the brain based on what we observe with these networks. They found that when attempting to mimic grid cells, brain cells used in navigation, while 90% of the networks could accomplish navigation-related tasks, only about 10% of those exhibited any behaviors similar to those of grid cells. But even this approximation of grid cell activity has less to do with the similarity between the neural networks in biological brains than it does with the rules programmed into the networks. Okay, so it's a little confusing, very sciencey to me. I don't know, it's a little confusing because it's just talking about a lot of things. But the main idea of this is that these people are saying while networks can maybe achieve some of like the same tasks that the brain can, they're not actually that similar. The rules that we use for the networks, like yes, they can do the same things, but they're not doing it necessarily in the same way. So they mimic them, but they're not really that similar. They just do it in a different way. And how do they do it? Using these rules programmed into the networks. But we're saying that they're not the same rules that the brain uses. They just achieve the same function, but they're a different set of rules. So we can't always make assumptions about the brain just by looking at the networks because the rules they use achieve the same goal but are not the same rules that the brain uses. But at least they get to the same task, okay? So they achieve the same tasks in different ways with different rules. So which finding, if true, would most directly support the claim in the underlying sentence? Well, why don't you take a second to see which one best proves our restatement. Okay, so I think A does that the most clearly. So the rules that allow for networks to exhibit behaviors like those of grid cells have no equivalent in the function of biological brains. It's pretty much what we're saying, right? So even though these rules can allow the networks to behave like grid cells, they don't actually have an equivalent in the brain. So they're similar but very different. They do the same thing, but they don't have the same rules. So they're very different from each other. Okay? Let's see why the other ones are wrong. So B, the networks that do not exhibit behaviors like those of grid cells were nonetheless programmed with rules that had proven useful in earlier neural network studies. Well, this isn't really drawing an explicit difference between the network and the brain. From this, I can't just look at this and be like, okay, so then networks and brain are really not that different, or so are really different. This doesn't say anything about the rules that programmed in the brain. It's just saying that sometimes the rules work, sometimes they don't, but it's not actually saying how similar or different they are from the actual brain. C, neural networks can often accomplish tasks that biobrains can do, true, but they are typically programmed with rules to model multiple types of brain cells simultaneously. This one is tempting because, yeah, it is saying what we said. They can accomplish tasks, but so they're about to contradict like that similarity. They're typically programmed with rules to multiply multiple types of brain cells simultaneously. This, I think, to me, this is still saying like it is still modeling the brain, but like just multiple things at the same time. It's kind of sidestepping the question, honestly. Like it's not directly saying that they're not different. It's just saying that, like, yeah, it's similar. It's just not as recognizable. It's kind of doing, it's still modeling the brain just at simultaneously. It's modeling different parts of the brain simultaneously. We're trying to say that these rules don't model the brain's rules or the brain cells at all. It's saying it's a different set of rules entirely that are still accomplishing the same task. So this is tempting, but it's not clearly saying that the rules in the brain are different. D, once a neural network is programmed, it is trained on certain tasks to see if it can independently arrive at processes that are similar to those performed by biological brains. Honestly, like, this isn't even a finding. This is just like saying like what they do with the neural networks, like to test them. It doesn't actually say like the results to see what happens when they run them. It's just saying that we see if they can independently or do the things that the brain does. But again, it's not saying that if it does them in the same way or does them in a different way. It's not really a finding to me, honestly. It's just saying what they do once they get the neural network up and running. So A, I think it's the most simplest one and the most clear one. It clearly says that the rules do have let the networks be like grid cells, but they don't actually have an equivalent function in the brain. They're a different set of rules that can do the same thing, but you won't find those same rules in the biological brain. So it's a little complicated, but I think if you kind of summarize the entire idea here that the networks and the brain are different and the rules guiding them are different, I think that's enough to go through the answer choices and eliminate them until you get to A. All right, so here we have a chart for this problem, so let's briefly scan it. So tadpole body mass and toxin production after 3 weeks in ponds. So they give us 3 different population densities. They tell us the average body mass, average number of distinct toxins or something, average amount of this stuff per tadpole, and then the average like concentration of the stuff in each tadpole. Okay, so these people investigated within species competition among common toads, a species that secretes various unpleasant tasting toxins called whatever in response to threats. The researchers tested their tadpoles' responses to different levels of competition by creating ponds with different tadpole population densities, but a fixed amount of food. Based on analysis of the tadpoles after 3 weeks, the researchers concluded that increased competition drove this stuff production at the expense of growth. Okay, so I think they're basically saying that they want to see what happens when there's more competition in this tadpole population. And since they're each given the same amount of food, I'm guessing the higher population density or the more tadpoles you have, the more competition there is. So when we say increased competition, we can also see like increased population density. They're kind of interchangeable here. And we're saying the more density you have, the more this stuff you're going to produce per tadpole probably, but at the expense of growth. So maybe that just means they're not going to grow as much with the higher population densities as they do in the lower population density. So more of this stuff and less mass, pretty much. So yeah, if I had to restate it, I just restate it like this. So less mass, more bee production. And then this here, I guess the number of distinct toxins, it doesn't really talk about that, so we don't really have to worry about that. But if we're looking at the graphs, things that will interest us is like this body mass, the average amount of this stuff for tadpole, and also the concentration, because these all tell us more about like how much bufalene or whatever, however you say that, each tadpole is producing. So you want to compare the bee per tadpole and also maybe the concentrations possibly, and the body mass for different population densities. So we want to compare at least one lower population density, one high population density, and compare how much bee stuff each tadpole is making and also their body mass and if it's less or more. Okay, so take a second to see which one does this, compares the body mass and how much they're producing for different population densities. Okay, so I think B does this the best. So tadpoles in the low and medium population density conditions had substantially lower average B concentrations, but had greater average body masses than those in the high population density condition. Okay, so I kind of like this answer because we're comparing the low and medium versus the high population, and we're saying it's kind of what we're saying, that because they're lower population density, each tadpole wasn't making as much of this stuff, so the concentration was a lot less. But because the higher density, the ones grow less, we're saying that the lower density ones grow more. So they had greater average body mass than those in the high population density condition. So it's comparing how much of the stuff they're making through the concentration and how much they're growing between all three population densities. Okay, let's walk through why each of the other answer choices. So A, the difference in average tadpole body mass was small between the low and medium population density conditions and substantially larger between the low and high population density conditions. This is not saying if, it's just talking about the difference in the mass. It's not even addressing the bee production part, so this is just wrong. Also, it's not saying if one is higher than the other, if it's like a positive or negative difference, so this is really not telling us anything. C, tadpoles in the high population density condition displayed a relatively modest increase in the average amount of bufalene, whatever, but roughly double the average bee concentration compared to those in the low population density. It is comparing stuff about the bee toxin, but again, it's not even addressing the mass part, which is still part of the conclusion, right? So it should be addressing all parts of the conclusion. So it is comparing, it is talking about this bee stuff, but since it's not talking about growth, this cannot be the right answer. D, tadpoles produced approximately the same number of different toxins per individual across the population density conditions, but average body mass decreased as the population density increased. Well, I mean, this one is talking about the body mass, but this first part is talking about the number of toxins, which doesn't really necessarily correlate to like how much bee stuff they're making. They're just saying how many distinct molecules or something are in there. And also we want to, even if this was the case, it's saying it's like doesn't vary across density conditions. Anything about bee stuff, we want to say that there's a difference across the population density. So this is kind of irrelevant, even though it does talk about the body mass. That leaves B as the clearest answer. It addresses how much bee stuff they're making and also the body mass and compares it across all three population densities. All right, so we have another non-graph question. In vertical inheritance, parents pass genes to their offspring, but in horizontal transfer, or HT, one species, often bacteria, passes genetic material to an unrelated species. In a 2022 study, herpetologist, and his team investigated HT in multicellular organisms, namely snakes and frogs in Madagascar.
The team detected BOFB and a gene transmitted vertically in snakes in many frog species. The apparent direction of the gene transfer seems counterintuitive, because frogs usually don't survive encounters with snakes, and so wouldn't be able to transmit the newly acquired gene to offspring. But the team concluded that BOFB is indeed transmitted from snakes to frogs, either directly or indirectly via HT. Okay, so it's a little complicated, but let's just break it down. So basically, they're saying when in vertical inheritance, it's just pretty much like when you have a baby and the genes pass down. You just keep having children and the genes keep passing down. But in horizontal transfer, bacteria passes genetic material from one species to like another species. So it's like cross species, not from birth, like just some other way. The gene is kind of inserted into another um, animal. And basically, they're saying that this BOFB stuff is kind of naturally occurring in snakes. So the snakes, like, they have it because their parents had it forever and ever. So it happens naturally in snakes. But they found it in frog species. And they're saying horizontal transfer doesn't make a lot of sense because if snakes have it and the frogs have it, if that means the snakes and frogs interacted, but the frogs usually will die when they interact with the snakes. So how do the frogs pass it down to their own kids? Like, that doesn't really make any sense. So they're just kind of confused, like how the gene is going from the snakes to the frog species. So my restatement of this claim is that snakes likely don't pass off their genes directly to frogs, but something else passes off the snake genes to this snake gene to the frogs, almost like a bacteria or something in the middle. So let's go to the answer choices and see which one is like a restatement, which kind of explains how the gene is going from the snakes to the frogs in a way that makes sense, like even the frogs usually would die when they have an encounter with a snake. Which one makes sense? Because basically the parasites, they feed on the snakes and they get BOFB from horizontal transfer, and then these parasites that have the BOFB, they go to the frogs from this experiment, and when they eat on the frogs, the BOFB transfers from the parasite to the frog. So it's like snake to parasite to the frog. And this is true because we know parasites feed on both of these things, so it's always in contact with these snakes and frogs. So that's how the gene transfers. A. BOFB can be transmitted across frog species through horizontal transfer. That's still not explaining how it gets from the snakes to the frogs. It's just saying among frogs that could happen, that's fine, but how does it get from the snakes to the frogs? C. BOFB cannot be reliably transmitted from a snake species to bacteria that are usually encountered by frog species. Well, this is kind of the opposite. This is saying that it can't happen because it is possible instead of a parasite in this situation, it was a bacteria. So the bacteria ate the snake, which ate the frog. But it's saying BOFB cannot be reliably transmitted. So that doesn't really make any sense because we want to prove that something is passing off the genes from the snake to the frog. So we want to answer choice that explains who exactly is doing that, how that is happening. D. Frog species with BOFB show few discernible advantages as compared with frog species that do not carry BOFB. This is just talking about like what the BOFB does for the frog, like what benefits it might have. Again, it doesn't really have anything to do with how is it getting from the snake to the frog. So in this one, it's not, so again, here the conclusion may not be as clear, but the point is that like you want to answer the question sort of like it is, how is the genes getting from the snake to the frog? You want to prove that it is. So you're trying to give an explanation. Which finding explains that conclusion? All right, this is finally our last question. So, okay, we have one more chart, and it says corn-related vocab in various southeastern languages. And like it says language family, then it says word. I see a lot of stuff. English translation, which is all just corn, and says proposed origin of this language family. So whatever. In Caddo, a language from what is now the U.S. Southeast, vocab pertaining to corn cultivation resembles equivalent vocab in the Totozocan language family in Mexico. This resemblance is perhaps attributable to cultural contact. Such words could have entered Caddo through the intermediary of neighboring but unrelated Chitimacha language. Concurrent with the dissemination of corn itself from Mexico into the southeast after 700 CE. That the vocabulary pertaining to domestic crops accompanies them as they diffuse into new regions is an established phenomenon globally. Crops may also be decoupled from vocabulary altogether. Corn cultivation became ubiquitous among the southeastern tribes, yet blank. Okay, there's a lot going on here. Basically, they're saying in Caddo, the words, the language they use for like crops and stuff is really similar to this Mexican language, and they're saying it might have come through from like another language called Chitimacha, and which is also kind of had cultural contact with the Toto Zaquayan, language family people. And so they're saying that it's really common for vocab, pertaining to crops to kind of diffuse and become similar among people who live near one another. It's very established. However, crops may also be decoupled from vocabulary altogether. So it's kind of weird because they said this whole entire thing talking about how the languages are similar, but we're saying that crops may also be decoupled or sort of detached from vocabulary altogether. And ubiquitous, I'm not sure what that means, but I'm saying I can see that like this entire thing is about corn. I see these other language families in the chart that they didn't mention here, and they're all about corn. So I'm assuming like corn cultivation, it means like it became common among all the southeastern tribes. However, blank. So I think they're trying to say that just because they grow the same crops doesn't mean the vocabulary is always similar for all southeastern languages. I think that's what they're trying to say. Again, all this stuff can be a little confusing, but just kind of hone in on the part where it says this part. Honestly, these last two sentences are kind of good enough. These vocab can be similar, but they can also be kind of different. They don't have to be similar, right? So what are we comparing? Well, if we just look at the graph, I mean, yes, this Caddo and Chitimacha are probably similar, and they'll kind of talk about that. But if I'm looking at all these southeastern tribes, I can see that no, not all of them are from the same origin, and they have different sounding words for them. So I think we're just trying to compare like the four languages and the difference in their word for corn or something like that. Okay, so take a minute and see which one kind of best illustrates like the difference among the four languages when we're talking about corn and how the words aren't always similar. Okay, so I think A, the origins of the vocab pertaining to the crop vary across languages in the region, with the words for corn in Cherokee and Muskegean languages showing no demonstrable relationship to the Mexican, the Toto Zaquayan vocab. And that's true. We can see Muskegean here and the Cherokee here. They're not related to the Totozacan family, and if you look at the words, they're also pretty different from these two, which are related to the Totozacan family. So there is no demonstrable relationship, so their words are pretty different. So this is why I like A, because it shows how these two languages are different from these other two. They're not related to the same language family like these two at the bottom are. Okay, let's look at the other ones. The region is linguistically diverse, being home not only to Chitimacha and Caddo, but also to the Muskegean language family and to one Iroquois language. Well, this is just telling me all the different languages, but it's not explicitly saying how the word for corn is different across the languages, so I don't really like this one. It's just telling me the different languages. C, corn-related vocab underwent changes when entering other unrelated languages, as can be seen by the divergence of the Caddo word from Chitimacha word it originated in. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the point. I mean, it is true that the corn-related vocab might have gone through changes, right? But I think that the Caddo and Chitimacha word are the ones that are the most similar to each other. I think that's what it's trying to say here, that Caddo and the Chitimacha words are pretty similar to each other. It's just these other two language families here that we see. It's not the same, even though they're from the same region as Caddo and Chitimacha. So I don't really think Caddo is where the divergence is, I think over here, these other two languages are where the divergence is, because this entire passage is about how Caddo and Chitimacha are sort of similar to the Mexican language. D, words for corn in the languages of the Muskogean family evolved from a common root, with the Muskogee words having lost certain consonant sounds still present in the Chickasaw and Choctaw words. Well, this is just talking about this specific language family, this Muskogean. We want to be talking about like all 4 language families. We want to be talking about all of like the southeastern languages. This is just focusing on the word for corn in this specific language family. But we want to talk about different language families, right? This one best says that the origins from across languages in the region, and takes example from multiple language families. This is just focusing on the Muskogean one. So that's why it's not really the best answer. So again, even if you didn't completely understand each of the answer choices for whatever reason, if you just keep in mind that we should be comparing like as many languages as we can and pointing out that like these ones up top are a little different from the ones below, that's enough to show how the origins of the vocab, they're not always going to be the same, even though even though the word is for the same crop, basically. All right, so we're finally done. I wanted to go over more questions this time because I just wanted to show that these questions are not as complicated as they seem. They definitely are tricky, but I think it's very easy to get intimidated. The trick is you don't need to understand every word, every line, like every answer choice. I think the answer choices especially can get very frustrating and confusing, but you do need to learn to recognize, okay, what is the claim? How can I rewrite it so it's a lot simpler and I can match it up to the data given to me? What should the answer choice include, right? Am I comparing something? What should it be mentioning? What should it not be mentioning? Like, what is some irrelevant information? Even if you identify these things, it's often enough for you to get the right answer, even if you don't understand the science or you don't understand exactly what the answer choice is saying. Using these things can eliminate a lot of answers. And also don't forget, check answer choices that just make no sense or just don't match up with the graph, because those are also easy to eliminate. So yeah, I mean, keep in mind the same strategies. Try not to get overwhelmed. Remember that you don't always need the graph, and really rely on the wording of these answer choices because it can take you a long way. So I hope it was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.